Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. Glad to have you with me. So, you know, on the radio program and oftentimes on this podcast, I talk an awful lot about millennials and the generation that is before the millennials. I'm not quite sure what we call them, and how they have this, and I think it's a lack of historical perspective about, you know, where the country's been, why we are the way we are, why our government works the way it does. There's just this horrible lack of perspective that would enable them to understand that these trendy ideas like hate speech and hate laws, socialism, Marxism, all of these things that they truly do not understand, but that the leadership, the political leadership of the country, and quite frankly, in my opinion, the media, has convinced them that these things are not just trendy, but that's what we really should do. Now, before I go into this discussion of capitalism, I also want to point out that while I'm a free market individual and I believe in capitalism, and I think that free markets and capitalism have done more than anything else to advance humankind, and that this country alone has done more to advance humankind than any other civilization in the history of the world, I also recognize that we have a few pimples on the face of capitalism. We have the problem of crony capitalism, where companies, large or small, doesn't make any difference, in my opinion, the size of the company, but they turn to the government. They turn to the government for regulation in hopes that that regulation will then, you know, kind of keep competition at bay. And then when they need something, they, of course, can then go make their campaign contributions, and they can get changes to the regulatory scheme. And it's just, that's the crony capitalism that I think gives capitalism a bad name. And then when you think about just pure capitalism, I mean, capitalism has to have a moral basis. You can't just go out and make money for the sake of money without regard to your coworkers, your employees, your shareholders. I believe that as an individual business owner, while in the purest sense, your job is to make as many widgets at the least costly manner that you can and sell them for the highest profit that you can. That's the purest form of capitalism. But I also believe that if you're the widget maker, and so you have employees and you have suppliers and you have vendors, and maybe if you're a publicly traded company, you have investors, or maybe even if you're a privately held company, you still have people that have invested in your company. I believe that you have a moral or fiduciary responsibility, and I'm not sure that those are separate. I mean, fiduciary has a legal connotation, and moral has more of an attitudinal perception, but I still believe that they're intertwined, fiduciary and morality. And I believe that capitalism needs to have that kind of moral underpinning. That doesn't mean, because some people will hear me say that and believe that, well, what Michael's saying is that the CEO of a company can't make more than, say, 2 times the lowest paid average salary hourly rate of the lowest paid worker in the company. That's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, I believe that CEOs, CFOs, the C-suite, workers, everybody in a company ought to be paid their fair market value, and that's determined between those who say, yes, I will go do that job for that amount, and the company that says, I want this job done for this amount. And when those two reach agreement, that's the way the free market works. You may think that people deserve to earn more. In fact, I don't think people deserve to earn more, but I want people to earn more. I want everybody to earn as much as they can. But let's go back to the whole concept of morality and capitalism. I think it is fundamentally trendy right now to be a socialist. and to denigrate capitalism wherever you have the opportunity to do so. But that raises the question, does this condemnation of capitalism really hold up to scrutiny? Well, there's a think tank in Canada called the Fraser Institute, and it publishes the Economic Freedom of the World report that tells us which countries have the freest, in other words, the most capitalist economies. And they rank the level of freedom of 162 economies using 43 indices across major policy areas, such as the size of government, the legal systems, property rights, fiscal policy, monetary policy, freedom to trade internationally, and how much government regulation. That's just a few of the indices that they look at. Well, the idea behind this report, and every year you hear people talking about the report and the rankings where the U.S. and other countries are. Well, the idea behind the report is that if you can find out which countries have the most capitalistic economies, you could actually use that information to see if more capitalist countries have better outcomes for their citizens when compared to more socialist counterpart countries. It's a really good way to measure, are people in socialist countries, Marxist countries, or for that matter, communist countries, are their outcomes, are the things that we measure quality of life by, shelter, clothing, food, our lifestyles, our leisure time, disposable income, all of those things. Are we better off in a capitalist country, or are we better off in a socialist country? So when the Economic Freedom of the World report comes out, what they do is they analyze the correlation between economic freedom and human well-being. So they split these 162 countries, let's call them economies. They split the 162 economies into quartiles based on their level of economic freedom. Every year, I find the results to be absolutely, well, I can think of a bunch of adjectives: amazing, staggering, frustrating, shocking, and, oh, of course. So let's start. Let's work through this year's report. The average income in the most capitalist quartile of countries is 6 times higher in real terms than the average income in the least capitalist economies. There is a 6-fold difference. So what's that in dollars? In the least capitalist countries, the average income is $6,140. What do you think the average income is in the most capitalist economies? Now, remember, we're talking on the low end, $6,140 a year. How many? I just want that number to soak in for a minute. But in the most capitalist economies, that number is $36,770, 6 times higher. So for the poorest in society, the gap widens even more. The bottom 10% of income earners in the most capitalist countries make, on average, 7 times more than the poorest 10% in the least free economies. Let me say that again. Let me say it slowly. I don't mean to be condescending, but I really want you to, because we often hear about, income gaps and how bad it is. Well, let's talk about income gaps between capitalist and non-capitalist economies. The bottom 10% of income earners in the most capitalist countries, so let's use the United States, for example. The bottom 10% earners in a country like ours make, on average, 7 times more than the poorest 10% in the least free economies. Now, likewise, more than 27% of people in the most socialist economies live in extreme poverty. That's defined by the World Bank as an income of less than $1.90 a day. Whereas just 1.8% of people in the freest economies live in extreme poverty. A figure that, of course, we'll always say is still too high because we don't want anybody to be in extreme poverty. But when you step back and you look at it at a 30,000-foot level, you understand that in the freest economies, the poorest of the poor account for only 1.8, abject poverty. Whereas in the socialist countries, the poorest of the poor count for more than a fourth. 27% of the people in the most socialist economies live in extreme poverty. But put economic measures aside for a minute. You know, people that live in the most capitalist countries also live on average 14 years longer. They have an infant mortality rate 6 times lower. We enjoy greater political and civil liberties, gender equality, and to the extent that you can measure these things, I think that we are generally happier too compared to people that live in the least capitalist economies. I think of Phidias. You know, I've mentioned Phidias before, the young man that produces this podcast for me. He has escaped what I would consider to be one of the least freest economies in the world, Venezuela, and has moved to Spain. So he has made a humongous change in his lifestyle, even though he may not yet have, a different job other than producing podcasts. But just changing countries alone, I think he would say, gave him greater happiness, and certainly gives him greater political and civil liberties, gives him greater gender equality, and gives him those things that you and I tend to take for granted. Happiness and freedom, property rights, all of those things that we just take for granted. Now let's go to Hong Kong, where we have all of the riots going and all the protests. Because why? Because they're trying to protect their economic freedom. Hong Kong is the world's freest economy, according to the Economic Freedom of the World report. Hong Kong. Why do you think they're protesting? Because they see that proverbial foot in the door of communist China, and if you live in the freest economy in the world, and one of the most tyrannical countries is trying to influence how you're going to live your life, I would hope that we would protest too. Back in 1941, journalist and travel writer Martha Gellhorn visited Hong Kong with her husband, Ernest Hemingway, and wrote, "The real Hong Kong was the most cruel poverty, worse than I had ever seen before, worse still because of an air of eternity. Life had always been like this. Life would always be like this." That was in 1941. But then, just a few years after Hemingway's wife visited, the Japanese surrendered in 1945, and that meant that British rule returned to Hong Kong, and with that British rule came a largely laissez-faire approach to the city's economy. So that by 1950, 5 years, by 1950, the average citizen in Hong Kong earned just 36% of what the average citizen in the United Kingdom earned. But as Hong Kong began to embrace the economic freedom, and remember, it's been the most capitalist economy every year, I think, since 1970, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 years, Hong Kong became substantially richer year after year after year. So that today, Hong Kong's gross domestic product per capita is a whopping 68% higher than the United Kingdom's. So the poverty that Hemingway's wife was bemoaning is gone. But why is it gone? Is it gone because of more government regulation? Is it gone because of the lack of private property rights? Is it gone because of socialism or communism or Marxism? No. The poverty that Hemingway's wife bemoaned when she went to Hong Kong in 1941 is gone because of economic freedom. Now, we can see a lot larger gaps if we pair a very capitalist country with an otherwise similarly situated socialist country. Give you an example. Chile versus Venezuela. West Germany versus East Germany, South Korea versus North Korea, Taiwan versus mainland China, Costa Rica versus Cuba. I know it's always, when you stop and you think about it in those terms, you suddenly realize, oh yeah, economic freedom is what has made this country fantastic. So all of these millennials and premillennials and whatever they are, or for that matter, all of the Democrat candidates running for office, anybody, I don't care what political stripe you wear, I don't care what side of the aisle you are on. If all you do is decry and criticize the pimples of capitalism, and you do so in a protest somewhere, well, you're just being trendy. And you're also being, quite frankly, a useful idiot. Because when you see the unsubstantiated claims, you should remember the data simply does not support those who want us to turn to socialism. The data is just the opposite. You can find, by simply Googling the Economic Freedom Report, Economic Freedom of the World. If you just Google that report, or DuckDuckGo it, or Bing it, or Yahoo it, however you do it, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. And just take a look at the list of the countries. And I know you'll see that the United States, drops and rises and drops and rises. And you see that we have problems sometimes with infant mortality rates, or we have a problem with this or that. Every country has problems. But in the grand scheme of things, comparing socialism or any sort of centrally planned economy with a free market economy like we have, I will always choose us. And so for all the millennials, the Gen Zers, the baby boomers that are running for president, all of these people that say that socialism is the answer, the facts don't support it. Period. Thanks for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.